It's the most wonderful time of the year when we're talking about cold and snow. But of course, the question on everyone's mind, just how cold and just how snowy is this winter going to be? To answer that question, we bring in an expert, Weather World extraordinaire alum, Paul Knight. Thanks so much for coming in out of retirement, out of the cold, to answer some questions today.
It's good to see you again, Rob. And yeah, it is the time of the year when folks are trying to figure out how much fuel should they purchase or whether it's time for a new winter coat. But you know, Rob, there are some default things we can say about recent patterns. And when we look at how things have been over the past couple of winters, maybe the past 5 or 10 years, this is a summary of what the trends are that we've noticed. And that is when it's warm, it gets very warm. When it turns cold, it rarely breaks records, so it'd be unusual to have record chill. There are long dry spells are pretty infrequent, especially this year.
Right.
And wet spells tend to be associated with record amounts of rain. And the default pattern ends up being that if we knew nothing else and we just looked at the past 10 seasons, we'd say that the nights generally are milder than normal, with long periods of slightly above normal temperatures. And the cold snaps tend to feel sharper to us, but they don't last as long. And that there's oftentimes light and moderate precipitation events.
Absolutely. We've talked about El Nino, the southern oscillation, here on Weather World before many times. This year, our pattern could be influenced by a variation of that, El Nino Modokai, which is Japanese. It stands for same but different. How could this influence the winter here?
I love the same but different. I like to make that my forecast regularly.
Right.
Well, this is what it looks like, Rob, and that is that the down below is the pattern that we're in right now, and we look right along the equatorial Pacific, and what you'll notice in this particular case is that the warmest waters, or the largest blobs of red and yellow, are out here in the central Pacific, which is, when we look up above, the typical El Nino is the warmest waters are in the eastern and central Pacific, whereas the El Nino Modokai, the one that's kind of looks like an El Nino but isn't exactly the same, has cooler water to the south and warmer water in the North Atlantic. So these two are what we're looking at, and that tends to be the pattern. Notice the difference, however, Rob, when we look at the anomalies of temperature and precipitation across the U.S. during wintertime, El Nino Modokai. It's dry in the Southwest. Typically, El Ninos are flooding in California, which they actually could use some rain.
Especially with the fires there recently.
Indeed. And look at the warmth. It's all over Western North America, and cold tends to be in blotches across Eastern North America. So that tends to kind of change the tone of what we might expect in this El Nino slightly different.
Yeah, slightly different pattern. Whenever you're looking at things, you don't only look at what's going on in the Central Pacific, right?
That's correct. In fact, the oceans are the driving force concerning seasonal anomalies. And we look at the North Pacific, which is already circled in there, where it's quite warm. And we look at the North Atlantic, not quite as warm, but nevertheless still pretty important. And we can then look at what happens when the North Pacific is warm. What is it typically like in the U.S. during December, January, and February temperature anomalies? Those are some of the years at the top. And look at this message, Rob, that is that the East Coast tends to be cooler than normal, and the warmth tends to be in blotches in the west and also in the middle of the country. Precipitation-wise, well, the wetness tends to be actually in the western plains, which is an unusual place in the wintertime. Dry tends to be dominant, indicated by those browns and yellows in the eastern part of North America. Now let's look at the effect of the warm North Atlantic. And there it's a piecemeal pattern. The coldest tends to be in eastern Canada. The warmth tends to be in parts of the eastern U.S. and also along the west coast. And we look at the precipitation pattern, we see that there's a message of it being generally dry. So that is that everywhere from the Appalachians eastward tends to be on the dry side. The wetness is more piecemeal in the Tennessee Valley and the upper plains and also in parts of the Rockies. So that would be the general pattern, and if we kind of summarize this, then
drum roll here for the big outlook.
Yes. Well, this is our best estimate at this point, and that is that there will be frequent periods of above normal temperatures. So I don't think it's going to be cold and staying cold for every day for this 90-day period coming up. And I think when we summarize the anomaly of temperature for December, January, February across Pennsylvania, I think it's going to average a degree or two above normal. By the way, we've never had 2 Decembers back-to-back with below normal temperatures. Last December in Pennsylvania was cold.
I remember that very cold snap at the end of December, early January.
And the last time we've had 2 Decembers below normal in Pennsylvania was back in 1980. So this would be quite a change. It'd be almost 40 years.
Right.
And I don't think that's going to happen. So I think it's going to be record warmth possible during the first half of December, maybe even through the middle of the month. And I think that record warmth, which could be as much as 5 or 7 days, will end with a big wet spell, big rainstorm. And then I think that the odds are that it's going to be coldest in either January, more likely February, from what I've just looked at today, with below zero readings in parts of Pennsylvania, especially in the mountains. Then that cold and moist will likely get together in the East Coast with some snowstorms, and they could be quite frequent in February, including what could be the first crippling snowfall in a couple of years here.
So our long shot predictions, for those who have been watching at home, we actually were saying very cold January because of the positive NAO, North Atlantic Oscillation, the past summer, but then also positive Indian Ocean Dipole could make for a snowy February. And it seems like your outlook kind of agrees with that long shots prediction.
Yeah, and these are all tied together, these atmospheric indices as well as the ocean indices. The NAO is an atmospheric, the IOD, the Indian Ocean, is a oceanic index. And I think that they're all kind of starting to focus in on the fact that there will be a cold, snowy time coming up this winter, although December, don't hold your breath for starting then.
And the real big question, too, it's been a very wet year, one of the wettest on record. Do you think that will continue?
From what we've seen in terms of the analogous forecast, no, it won't be as wet, but I do think that it won't take all that much for us to get some appreciable snow.
Great. Well, thank you for the expert advice and insight today, Paul.
My pleasure.
We've got a recap of your forecast coming up next.